Welcome everybody to today's Human Capital Watch, this month's Human Capital Watch for November. October 1919. I'm Mary Young, Principal Researcher for the Conference Board in Human Capital, and I will introduce you in a moment to my guests, but I want to just give you an overall view of today's webcast. So let me just start by saying we're going to begin talking today about what digital transformation is, what AI is and what it isn't, because those are often confused. We're going to talk about AI as a continuum. So it's not just an either-or thing, but in fact it's really important to understand the sort of variations and the spectrum of intelligence that's available in AI. We're also going to talk about what this means for HR. What are we seeing today in terms of AI-ish applications and what might we see in the future? And then finally, we're going to talk importantly about some of the legal and risk issues associated with the use of AI. And it's really important for HR people to understand that. So that's the overview of today's content. Before I go any further and I introduce our guests, I want to just walk you through a couple of sort of nuts and bolts type items. And you can see in the pod on your screen that you can download the presentation by clicking on one box. You can also ask questions, and I want to really encourage you to do that. We'll be monitoring those closely, and I will, in particular, once we get past this, we complete this section on defining AI, I'm going to look to see if people have asked any questions for clarification. And we'll continue talking about it with some concrete examples applied to HR, but please, don't save those questions to the end, because we really want to make sure, it's probably the most important takeaway from today's webcast, is that you come away with a much greater confidence that you understand what AI is and isn't. So with that, let me just also remind you that if you are taking today's webcast for credit, you need to stay on for the entire webcast, and you'll see also on your screen that you can choose either HRCI certification credits or SHRM credits or CPEs, and so please indicate that at the beginning of the webcast if that's something that you'd like to do. So with that, I would like to introduce my two guests, and to my immediate right, I guess would be your left, is Steve Scheinberg, who's the General Counsel of the Antidefamation League and also Senior Vice President for Privacy and Risk. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad.
Yeah, well, we know that privacy and risk and other legal issues are really important, so we're glad to have an expert with us.
Thank you.
And then over to Steve's right is Professor Lyle Yorks from Columbia Teachers College, an expert in organizational development, particularly leadership development. And Lyle is also a distinguished principal researcher here for the Conference Board, and we're really glad you're here too, Lyle.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here as well. So,
yeah.
Yes.
And Lyle is one of 3 co-authors on our forthcoming report on AI and HR. Our third author is Dr. Amy Abel, and you will have a chance to hear from her sometime in the future for sure, because this topic of AI for HR is something the Conference Board knows is really important, and we're doing a number of pieces of research related to this topic. Today we're going to share with you some of the very foundational pieces. So let me just say that AI, we all know, is probably the biggest, hottest trend in business today. It's something that we're hearing a lot about in HR, but I want to tell you, I swear, more often than not, when you hear people talk about AI, they're not really talking about AI. So this is where we began with our research, is getting a firmer understanding and trying to come up with models that would help our members understand this better. And I now think of AI as a sort of bright, shiny object, where everybody wants to say what they have is AI. And I'm going to give you a couple experts' views that really reinforce that. Here is from an AI expert and blogger, and he says that AI has a kind of mystic aura, and that organizations, by which he means vendors, find it more profitable to use the term to describe their products, and so they do so, with wild abandon. Another expert in this field is John Sumser, and he says that there's a working consensus. He's a real expert in HR technology. There's a working consensus among the product owners and the developers of HR technology that a lot of what they're producing isn't really AI, but they're caught in a hard place, because if they don't call their products AI and their competitors are, then they're losing out. So people just jump on the bandwagon. So one more. I love this particular research statistic, which is from the UK, but when they looked at companies that were promoting themselves as AI company and their solutions as AI products or approaches, that more than 40% of them weren't actually using AI. So I hope what this leaves you with is a sense that you need to kick the tires a little bit, that right now it's very advantageous to call what you do AI, but a lot of what's out there isn't strictly speaking AI. So why is that? Let me give you a little bit more information about it. Here's our definition, by the way, and this is that AI is technology that mimics human intelligence. It can do all of these things. It can reason, it can make assumptions, it can learn and get smarter. Just as, for example, maybe your Netflix recommendations or your Amazon recommendations get smarter the more you purchase. Maybe they don't, but that's the theory anyway. So that would be an example of how AI can learn. And it can get better, the more data it has at predicting, so the quality of the output gets better and better. Now that is sort of the gold standard for AI. The trouble is, as I've mentioned before, that there are many other things that claim to be AI, and so we think it's very useful to use a model that actually looks at different degrees or gradations or shades of AI, because that actually allows us to differentiate between different levels of intelligence instead of lumping everything into the same bucket. So that's a model that we've developed, and I'll walk you through that in a moment. But coming back to what is AI, what are some specifics? Today we see things like natural language processing, text analytics that you can use in your companies, for example, to analyze open-ended questions in employee surveys or polls, to not only understand what are the common themes you're seeing from your employees, but also get a handle on what's called sentiment analysis, where you look at sort of what are the underlying feelings that people are expressing. It could be, the use of chatbots, or it could be computer vision, or voice recognition, or visual recognition, or machine learning. Some of these things have been used in human capital analytics for a while, although we would argue that analytics does not necessarily equate to artificial intelligence. But something that's really important that we don't show on this diagram is that what's under the umbrella keeps changing. And that's one of the reasons that people sometimes say, oh, AI, you can't even define it, it's so fuzzy, etc. It actually isn't fuzzy. We've given you a clear definition. The reason that people perceive it as being fuzzy is that every time there's a new bright, shiny object, it gets called AI, and things that were once bright, shiny objects, think of your handheld, your pocket calculator, or think of something like a search engine. Initially called AI, they sort of get booted out of the umbrella as new things come in. So part of the confusion is, as technology changes very quickly, what we think of as AI shifts as older examples tarnish a little bit and newer, brighter, shiny ones come under the umbrella. Okay, so let's apply this. This is what I talked about in terms of understanding AI is not a binary thing. It is AI. It isn't AI. This is a model that was developed by Anand Rao at PwC. His model looks different from this, but we're indebted to him for the 4 categories that he identified that are helpful in differentiating AI and making it not just one big bucket. So on the left in this model, you see automation. Automation is not AI, but we always hear people who say, yeah, I mean, you've got machines that pick apples or whatever, that's AI. No, that's about you're using robots that are, it's mechanical. You could have a machine that performs tasks. They could be cognitive tasks, they could be physical tasks, but it's not thinking. And it's performing the same set task, often a back office, a very routine task, over and over and over again, but with no variation. That's automation. Now we're going to move up the level. We're going to move up into the whole area of intelligence. The next point on this continuum is assisted intelligence. And assisted intelligence is something that you're probably using today, and that's when technology takes routine tasks and performs them faster or better than people can. People are still making the decisions. You get a report on attendance at training programs or on the distribution of performance grades. You still are making decisions, but you're empowered and your productivity is enhanced by this technology that assists you in doing that. But importantly, humans are still making the decisions, doing the thinking. That's assisted. Now let's move up one more level on this continuum to augmented. With augmented intelligence, we're seeing humans and technology each contributing what they do best. In this case, great examples are the Netflix recommendations or any other, the ads that pop up on your screen that are based on what you've been shopping, the lists of candidates that you might get or from your system based on criteria. You've provided the criteria. You've told it what you're looking for. If you're doing analytics, you've provided the questions that you want to have answered and the variables you want the technology to look at. But it is seeing things in the data you as a human could never have seen. It's analyzing much bigger data sets than any humans could ever analyze, and doing it in real time. So those are all very valuable contributions that technology is making, and it's enabling you as humans to do things that you couldn't have done before. But you are still making the final decision. Okay, now we're going to go over as far as you can go to the right, the highest form of intelligence. And this is the one that really resembles our gold standard of artificial intelligence. And that's what's, autonomous intelligence. And just as that name implies, this is technology, this is a system that can take the whole process, the whole thinking process, analytic process, behavioral process, whatever it is, basically from the very start to the very finish and not require any human input. This is something that we don't see in HR today. And there are very few examples today anywhere of something that intelligence that can act absolutely autonomously. But it's important to understand, that could be the ultimate form of machine intelligence. So I walked you through this model, which teases out 4 different types of use of technology, 3 of which we describe as intelligent, but they're representing different levels in terms of how involved people need to be, and in terms of the technology's ability to learn as it goes along. And while we wrestle here at the conference board, we still continue to sometimes have debates about, is this really assisted or is it augmented, et cetera. I won't claim that this is easy. I think this is a set of principles can help you think about what HR technology that you might be considering is capable of and what it's not. But I want to make this concrete, and so I'm going to ask Lyle in a moment to walk us through a few HR examples. In the interim, I'm just going to check to see if anybody's asked any clarifying questions about this definition. And in fact, it looks as if nobody has. It's not too late, so you could still ask clarifying questions about what AI is, although it may also become somewhat clearer as Lyle walks us through some HR examples, and we hear from Steve about any concerns that these might raise. So Lyle, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. And if we now take the model that was just being described and we look at how it applies to coaching, first of all, I can frame it overall by saying that organizations are looking at ways of being very innovative right now in terms of how coaching is really being delivered. And if we and AI is really what's helping to drive that sort of interest at this time. And I'll get a little more specific in a moment. But if we look at the slide that you see up there on your screen, automation, of course, as was just described, is not AI, but it's storing data and what have you. And that's the data storage that many times people draw on as they start to think about how could we use AI in a more effective kind of way. But if we move over to assisted intelligence, and that's the category that's most widely being used at this particular point in time, it's actually providing the opportunity for organizations to make coaching available to a much broader group of people within the organization. As I'm sure everyone there in the audience knows, that up until this point in time, coaching has primarily been directed more towards executives and senior management. It has started getting moved into much more specific kinds of areas, such as sales coaching or how managers provide support and things of that nature. But just as a concrete example of assisted intelligence and how that's allowing organizations to be able to make this kind of service more available within an organization, it actually provides a list of all the topics and the coaches that are linked to those that someone who feels they want coaching on a particular area to gain access to. And they can compare the bios of the coaches and their availability. And at that point in time, then they can make a decision to be able to go ahead and try to schedule some time with one of those coaches. And looking at one organization that's done this very expansively, what that basically does is schedule a 1-hour coaching process that is particularly targeted to that particular individual. So what you're seeing is the coaching becoming much more focused and much more targeted on an as needed basis and being available to people throughout the organization. What are some of the advantages of that? Well, just using that as one example, it provides faster and better access to coaches with regard to immediate needs. It also provides for much more flexibility, both on the part of the coaches and the coachees, because they can schedule at a time that works for both. And in fact, I know of a couple of organizations that find that a lot of people prefer to do the coaching not during the regular workday, but offline. It allows coaches to be able to schedule these things so they interact.
They don't have to be face to face.
Yeah, they do. And interestingly enough, people come to it much more focused, and with technologies like Zoom and what you have, you can do this remote. It also provides an opportunity to gather and provide feedback to the coaches and the coachees. And interestingly, one other example of this comes from one of the pharmaceutical companies that looked at. Managers also many times get reminders of things. So, for example, the system is really processing. Perhaps an employee hasn't taken enough vacation time, as one person pointed out on an earlier one, or needs to update a certain kind of certification or things of that nature. And the manager gets that sort of suggestion that then they can have that information
Nudging.
and actually act on. So it's a nudging kind of thing. If we move over to the augmented area, now here's where they're using, the system can use much more aggregated data to really look at patterns, and they can assess, among other things, and this again comes from a client organization here at the conference board, who's using coaching. So who is actually using it? What are they using it for? When are they using the coaching? And what groups or roles analyzing that might need a particular kind of coaching on particular issues. So in short, it's actually providing out, and as I'm sure everybody out there already knows, that in today's world, management development and even professional development and workforce development is less reliant on workshops and courses, and much more using this as one of the ways of being able to target both groups or individuals that could particularly benefit from that. And here again, to go back to what was being said earlier, pretty clear that it's still the human that's making the decision, because you get these choices recommended to you, but then you make the decision as to what I'm going to do to act on that, so to speak. So one thing I will say then, it makes coaching to become much more personalized and much more condensed and targeted. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the long-term coaching has gone away, executive coach thing, that still exists, but this is providing support and so forth. In fact, going back to the pharmaceutical organization I've referred to, they're actually using this to better train some of their field managers that are spread all over the country on how to do coaching with their employees, and how, particularly with the sales force and things of that nature. So
Coaching coaches. Yeah.
And how managers can be more effective in doing that. And then looking, we've had some discussion whether this is really an example of automated or not, but there actually is an application where when somebody is a salesperson is actually engaging with a client and they're having a conversation online, the system actually generates recommendations to them, which the client can't see on their screen, but comes up, such as slow down or give more examples. Or I'm sure most people out there would think, boy, Lyle York could really benefit from that right now if he could look at his screen and it would say, be more specific here.
I wanted to interject and say, well, this is what I mean about us. We find ourselves debating sometimes, is this kind of intelligence or another? I hear what you're saying, this example of getting real-time prompts about changing, what would be more effective. To me, that's augmented, but rather than autonomous. But we can continue to debate these things, because we do. But it also reminds me, Lyle, several of my colleagues and I did a study recently that was looking at other kinds of training. And just as you're talking about salespeople getting these real-time prompts, we learned about another product which can be used in teams. It is providing team members, there's a sort of dashboard on the screen, so when they're having online discussions, making decisions, working on R&D projects, innovation projects, they're getting real-time feedback about turn-taking, who dominates the conversation. It can be group-level feedback, or it can be about the team. The team can also get reports that show how its behavior has changed over time. And something else I'm thinking you're talking about is you could, in a very nice way, integrate that data that you're talking about, how who's had what kind of coaching, what roles, etc. You could integrate that with performance data.
Yes, and it is being done now. Yes, it is being done that way. And in fact, it's that kind of integration that also makes recommendations to both the coach and the coachee about how they can use the process better and so forth, because as there's assessments made of how the actual conversation has unfolded and so forth. So
your coaching wasn't helpful.
Well, no, I don't think.
No.
I think. Yeah, I think it's much more skilled than that.
Yeah. Well, we also, and this is in our learning analytics research, learned how, at least at one company, not only did the learning and development people get reports like these synthesized on what's the demand for certain skills, and what job families are asking for those. But they also got, the system could integrate that with what's our supply of that training. So if it's a particular, let's say it's some kind of bit currency thing that people want to learn more about, how much of that do we have? Do we need more? What are the areas that we might want to add, et cetera? Again, L&D is making the decision, but the system is proactively going after kinds of information that could increase the insights.
Oh, yes, yeah, very much so. And again, what I'm sharing with you here are things that have grown out of the research. I am having some ongoing conversations with a colleague of mine who runs the coaching certification program, Terry Mopey, about how this might be applied and so forth. We actually co-presented, we being Amy and I, at a prior conference, and how this can actually enhance the process. But one of the things that is, again, coming out of looking at some of the presentations and the interviews, is what you're seeing a movement towards is, and who knows what the time frame is going to be, as you start to move more towards augmented and at some point maybe even a little bit more autonomous and whatever. There's, at least in the foreseeable future, how coaches interact is going to involve them being able to respond well and know what's happening on the side of the machine, be able to interpret why certain kinds of data are coming out, because what the machine can do very well, automated intelligence can do very well, is be able to automate things in a way they can be able to standardize. It's less likely to have an emotional reaction. I mean, even if I'm a trained coach, certain things might trigger this or things of that nature. So in some respects it can depersonalize, and of course with the outcome of facial recognition, the machine are making certain judgments there.
Yes. But
what the human can still do is understand the complexity of the broader system and how things are actually operating. They are able to contextualize it in a way that, as of right now, the machine is not part of the system.
Yes.
It's not part of the interaction, and can also, the human coach is able to be involved. The actual coach is able to push somebody a little harder to dig deeper into this, facilitate reflection, things of that nature. So it looks like it's evolving more and more towards what in the future will be a partnership.
Augmented.
Yes,
Yes.
augmented in a lot of ways. That's what I think will be the primary one.
So I know you want to ask Steve about the legal implications.
Yes, Steve.
But I actually, may I just share a few questions that we've had from our audience?
Sure.
So we've had a number of comments. Thanks very much for those. One of them had to do with, somebody asked specifically, where would you put machine learning on this continuum? And I think because it involves, truly it does involve learning. It involves getting smarter, a system that continue to synthesize more data as it becomes available and get smarter and refine its conclusions or its assumptions or its recommendations. I would say that is, we're moving into the augmented in that it's thinking. So that's where I would place that on the continuum. I'm sure that there are more sophisticated and less sophisticated applications of machine learning. So, but I see that because it's actually thinking and processing information, not just things that you've told it to do. I think that could move into augmented.
Yes.
You would agree?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Here's another one. Lyle, this is for you. And somebody asked if you could tell us about any specific tools. We're not recommending any, but just do any come to mind in terms of specific AI tools that could be used in coaching?
I'll need to give that some thought.
Okay.
Because some of the ones that I've been studying, whatever, are proprietary, and they're inside the organizations that have been actually developing them and so forth.
Sure.
Yeah.
One thing we can do is, if after the fact that you do have something to share, we can provide you with the contact
my
information.
files, and I can give them the contact information.
That would, okay, perfect.
Yeah,
that would be great. And let me just check to make sure, see what else we've got here for questions. And let's see. Somebody's talking about Brainshark.
Yeah.
Is that one you're familiar with?
That's one that I've heard of and looked at and is being used, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So it says they leverage biometrics, so measures of your pulse, your whether you're experiencing stress, etc. Yeah, and it's another feedback element, and also doing automated sourcing and assessment. You're going to be talking, and I know in a moment, about the automated sourcing and assessment of candidates. But I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're going to ask Steve a question.
Yes, well, I was going to ask Steve what he sees as the legal implications of that, or
in coaching.
In coaching,
well,
yes.
I think I'll take it, thank you very much, and very informative, and I'll take it a little broader and talk about the issue in all of HR,
Yes.
sort of as in the broader area. But first, before I do that, first of all, I want to thank you for having me here today, and as importantly, as a non-author of the report that's coming out, I want to say congratulations on what it looks like an excellent report with two clear contributions that I think folks ought to be paying attention to. First is this definition of AI. I think the term is used so loosely around, and having a clear definition, agree with it, don't agree with it, think it's spot on, don't think, it's a starting place, it's a great place for the conversation. And secondly, the conversation about the gradations.
Yes.
Is critically important, not just in understanding AI itself, but also understanding what you're purchasing and your role as someone with legal and ethical duties associated with it. And in fact, one of your colleagues asks in the questions, what are the legal and ethical duties? And so I would take a moment to do that, and I'll move the slide a little forward if it will go. There we go. And I would like to talk a little bit about AI and talent acquisition, but also just generally. So I think the most important and foundational element here to remember is that AI is a human tool, right? It may use technology to do its work. It may appear to be a bright, shiny electronic object, but at the end of the day, it's humans who are programming it. It's humans who are interpreting it. It's humans who are deploying it. And as we know that at every stage of human involvement, there's the opportunity for bias, bigotry to creep in. And we need to understand these technologies enough to understand where those biases, where that bigotry may creep in. So in fact, AI is a human tool, and AI will, wherever it falls on the spectrum, encode human bias. And we have an obligation as lawyers, as HR professionals, as scholars, as researchers, to understand how that bias gets encoded. And that's my overall thought on the subject. So when we look at, for example, what's on the screen, the slide, we see that we can apply the gradations of AI to talent acquisition, from simple resume sorting all the way to deeply understanding the nature of the position and trying to come out with either a recommendation or actually a hire in an area. But each one of those things where it talks about assisted, augmented, and autonomous, each of those is a degree of how the equipment operates and how it's designed to operate. But almost inversely, you have a duty to understand, manage, and deal with the risk that's associated with that. So, sort of if the assisted intelligence, augmented intelligence, and autonomous intelligence are creating a hands-off approach this way, well, your legal obligations and your risk obligations move up the exact same way. As the more you're hands-off, the more you've got to look.
Well, that I think, if I can just interject for a second, if we look at the lower part there on the PowerPoint, where it said, and this is an ongoing conversation that we've had within our team here, for numerous reasons, autonomous intelligence may never be acceptable to HR.
Right.
For the reasons that I think you're starting to come in there, or at least you need to have some kind of way of tracking what are the biases. And for example, there've been there've been several organizations that have found that the recommendations that come out are based on past hiring practices. So therefore, the males get right up at the top, and, and then when women get put down,
I think that's critical.
Plays into that. Yes,
that's critical, because when you're looking for a good employee, you're looking, what are you basing it on? You're basing on your traditional understanding of good employee. And who is that? It's the people who in the past have been favored, promoted, and moved. and that encodes human bias. So we have to ask ourselves at every step, and I put a list of questions in the slide deck that you can download later. I won't go through it now. But there are a number of fundamental questions I think you need to ask when looking at to use AI, augmented intelligence, or even autonomous intelligence in your work. And that is, who is there? It's the who, what, where, when. Who's programmed this thing? What do they understand? And what data sets are they using? And if we understand those things, we can start really peeling back the layers of bias. We can understand that perhaps the coding of a data set about who's a good employee, as was just said, may be deeply influenced by the past behavior of the organization, by advancing perhaps folks who are in a particular category or class, but who have not been the optimal performers. We also have to understand who the data scientists who are doing this work. If we don't understand who's creating this technology, we're going to find ourselves answering questions about, God forbid, in a deposition, you're going to find yourself answering questions about the technology that you may not be ready to understand. You need to have a person who's doing this work, who understands this work, but also understands that they're working in an HR context. And I think that the report and this conversation and other conversations like it are critical to making sure that we all understand what we need to ask, when we need to ask it, and how aggressively we need to ask those questions.
Well, it actually, what goes through my mind as you're talking is like almost everything in life, there are upsides and downsides to it, and you got to not just pay attention to the upside, you got to also look at what are the potential downsides, whether they be losses or building into some sort of process that needs to be looked at and changed in the organization. I think the one advantage with regard to talent acquisition, as well as what we were talking about earlier, is that it gives access to a much wider range of people. If we look at the talent, if we look at the hiring process as one where first, how do we brand the organization and make it more attractive so we get more people interested in us, particularly if we're not in Silicon Valley and we're trying to get more young people and whatever. And also early curve. And then looking at, there's really two pieces of that. There's the inboarding, which means you're trying to look and assess the people across the organization who might not have historically been on the radar screen or might not step up, but could be potential good fits for this job. And then also getting acquisitions of people, like I'm sure everybody out there already knows that nowadays you don't just look at what were the resumes that were submitted, you're looking at what people are doing what on LinkedIn or wherever it may be, and you approach them. Well, this gives you a massive access to a database for what are the most potential people that we can start to really assess, but then those decisions still have to be made by the person, by the HR professional, and also going to what you were just saying, then also start to look for what are the internal biases. When you look at the patterns that are coming out of augmented intelligence, what are the biases that are reflected in the patterns, perhaps?
Right.
And bring that. Anyway, I don't know, what's your response to that?
No, I think it's right. And actually, to be 100% clear, I consider myself pretty pro autonomous intelligence technology, and I'm really excited to see what it's going to do, particularly to the legal field and a whole range of areas. I think the upside is fabulous, but we just can't take our hands off the wheel. And the words like assisted, augmented, and autonomous, which are deadly accurate in how they explain the continuum, are terms about the technology. They're not terms about our responsibility, right? We just don't have an autonomous. There shouldn't be an autonomous system running your HR department, and that's for permanent employment for HR folks, I promise you. But we just know that these models, even as exciting as they are not always successful. And I can use the flip example. This isn't a news program, but I'll use a flip example anyway. You know what recommendations you get on Netflix or Amazon, and then rarely right. But that being said, we just have to make sure that we're not doing things that encode bad ways of thinking about the world, ethically and legally suspect ways of thinking about the world, and really use this technology to, as you said, the full potential, not just scouring this group of candidates, but finding the best person out there, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. It's a huge opportunity for an advancement in this world, but we can't take our hands off the wheel.
Yeah, and two comments to that, Steve, is one is that we know that in terms of the world of skills, that data science skills, analytics skills are some of the most sought after and the ones for which the supply is least adequate. And therefore, I think the potential is even greater to have individuals in those roles who aren't perhaps as seasoned as we would like them to be, or making judgments. You talked about the sensitivity of HR data, the consequences of getting this stuff wrong. If you're filtered out of an applicant pool because you don't match the profile of the people who used to have the job or have historically been hired, if a system assigns a compensation level to you that's going to follow you for the rest of your career. I mean, these are things that affect people's lives long term. They're very difficult to reverse, and the stakes are awfully high here. And the data scientists may not realize how different it is. I mean, if you're talking about human beings and the sensitivity of the data, the repercussions, but also the whole matter of personal data.
A bad movie recommendation lasts, a couple of miserable hours. This could, as you said, follow someone for their entire lives. I think that the change in the data science profession is laudable. It's becoming more professionalized, and people are taking a great deal of study. But we have to understand that data science shouldn't work in a vacuum. And we have to expect that data scientists and HR professionals and lawyers and industrial and organizational psychologists, et cetera, but critically human resources professionals have to be there with them, asking what questions they're asking. They're trained to do the work. They're skilled at doing these incredible data transformations, but they need to understand, and I'm sure they wish to understand, the legal, ethical, and social consequences of the work that they do.
Well, actually, one thing that's built, if I may say, going back to the first slide that was shown that just laid out the 4 levels, you notice that the form of the human was getting lighter, dimmer as you went from one to the other. But even in the automated, there's a dim version of that, and what that really implies is you still have to have somebody monitoring the system and seeing what the system is producing. Right. It's never that you can't have some oversight in terms of how this is actually playing out. That's important.
So it's an important graphic, and as I said, I think it really helps advance our thinking on the topic. But maybe it's a self-preservation recommendation. But as that human gets dimmer, your lawyer line is going to get brighter, but your HR pro line is going to get brighter. Not because they have to be not because they have to understand what. They're running these systems, right? These things become more hands-off, but they have to continually assess them for fairness, audit them, make sure that they continue to function the way you want them to function. These things are not set it and forget it and move on with your life. These have to be constantly monitored. So it changes the nature of the work that's being performed from doing the selection to making sure that the selections that are being made are within bounds of legal, ethical, and social constraints.
Is this in the skill set of most corporate legal teams? I mean, this doesn't sound like what they used to do in their work.
Well, it's my belief that it's not in the skill set of a lot of lawyers and a lot of HR pros and a lot of other folks. That's not a criticism. It's just now the time to learn. This is the opportunity. This is the era. As this stuff comes online, we owe it to ourselves as professionals. The lawyers and the rules of professional conduct have an obligation to be competent in their work. And you can't be competent in your work if your company is going to bring on a so-called AI system, regardless of where it truly falls on the spectrum, and you don't know enough how to interrogate that procurement. And the same thing is true with an HR professional. You have to be able to interrogate the procurement.
I love that term. It makes a lot of sense. And we talked about bias. Explainability is another thing that really we've been talking about indirectly. But another important thing is that a model that works today, that's right and has a very good reliability, may deteriorate over time. Things may change, And so it's not just checking once to see is that algorithm doing a good job, but it's tracking it over time because that, its performance could go downhill.
The last place in the world you want to be verifying the performance of your AI system is during a deposition, right? You want to do it continuously and outside of that environment. Right? And we don't want the law to have, this will become regulated by lawsuit.
Yes.
And that's probably not the best way to regulate this new area of technology.
Yes.
So who else besides, chief counsel or the legal team, who else ought to be involved in this sort of oversight and helping HR make good decisions and use this effectively?
Well, I think that this is an HR function as much as it is a legal function. I mean, I'm an employment lawyer at heart, and so I take these things particularly seriously, but I think that with the good work of the folks at this table and then the third author, I think we're going to get a lot of great guidance on how to think through these things. But there's absolutely no reason why anyone can't learn the guts of this. I really started working on this stuff when a vendor promised me that there was AI in the system that we were going to buy. And I asked a couple of questions, what do you mean? And I didn't know anything. So I went out and I did some work. It wasn't, I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I just went and looked at some interesting things out there. And it became very clear that this was a little bit of a Wild West in terms of the legal regulation and, frankly, the moral and social regulation.
Yeah. Well, we do hear about risk being involved in this, certainly IT, data privacy, which is sometimes its own function within an organization.
Correct. So that's another critical issue. Is that, for example, you're talking about coaching. And you're talking about sometimes very intimate information about individuals, right? You're assessing from them who they are and psychological information. What are you doing with that data? Right. How are you sharing it?
Right.
How are you storing it? How are you transmitting it? So I think that this is, that the privacy implications of the stuff is very important. Again, these are not barriers. Right? These are just things we have to learn. These are just things we have to do, I think, better. That's my position.
Yep, no, I agree completely, and we've already seen examples of how technology allows stuff that people have, posted online gets used and misused and sold as.
Indeed, indeed.
So you have to be very careful. I could agree, and I think I would just add, we've been talking about talent acquisition, but I would also add how particularly the augmented provides a great opportunity for addressing another issue that's big these days, which is which people, particularly critical ones in terms of our ability to perform as an organization, are most likely to leave the organization. So it's not only on the acquisition side, but the potential for addressing issues around retention.
Absolutely.
Because the AI system can look at very wide, broad bases of HR data, and number one can obviously predict, okay, what groups, as we said in the past, need help, support, or things of that nature, but it can also predict which ones are most likely to leave by looking at the past patterns and who's most likely to. And retention of talent in today's world is for core talent that is going to impact your performance. So then, so it actually provides the organization with the opportunity to take some interventions that it wouldn't otherwise do. And in some cases, it could actually be organization-wide, which is dealing with policies like compensation or things of that nature, or it could be focusing on an individual intervention to try to retain somebody. Like we know one organization, we studied it for a prior study where it's a consulting firm, I won't mention them, but they have a hard time keeping people, their young, high talented people, from not wanting to always move on to broaden their experience. So they put in place a policy that if somebody's on a 3-year project, at the end of the second year, they're already being exposed to what are the upcoming opportunities and so forth, and which product would they like to have, so that they get ahead of the curve because right now I can say, well, none of my students expect to work for the same organization for more than 5 or 6 or 7 years. I mean, unless there's something that really engages them in some kind of way.
Yeah. Another way AI could be useful is in helping organizations identify who in their workforce would be most prepared to be reskilled for particular new areas.
Yes.
And that could be by searching not just their employee profiles and certainly not just their job descriptions, but it could be other social media activities that they have, or looking at prior experiences that might not be showing up in the HRIS system. Mm-hmm. Now, Lyle, I know we have some other examples, and I want to remind our listeners out there that there's still time to submit some questions. But I know that you have another example about comp and benefits and how AI could help that.
Well, that's actually the one that I just shared with you with comp and benefits, would be able to actually look at, well, no, I didn't say this last time, but it's an opportunity to also gather data from the broader marketplace and be able to look at how the practices of your organization with regard to comp and benefits compare with some of the people that are real, not people, but some of the organizations that are your competitors for talent, and where that stakes in. But it can also allow you to start to look at what are the needs of people in our organization, what's the connection between certain kinds of benefits and productivity, between retention.
The timing of those things.
The timing of those things, they're all interconnected. The reality is it's no longer just thinking in terms of these as separate pieces. In fact, if I look at the whole talent management process, it starts all the way with, okay, how can we use this to better attract talent, inboarding, retain talent, which is, and also outboarding, drawing people to it, us approaching people that we might not otherwise be, talking to, but then also shifting it over to then how can we look at their experience in our organization and then really personalize the coaching and the development opportunities that are provided to them, and what are the HR overall structures such as compensation and so forth that can be used to address some of the issues that we're seeing in terms of what's the pattern, because the younger generation, these data can look at things and do comparison across generational groups and how that's shifting and
find factors that HR might not have realized were important.
Yes.
By doing text analytics or sentiment analysis and being able to say, actually this wasn't on your list, but it turns out that one of the key factors, let's say millennials' value in the workplace is belonging. So now we know we weren't looking for that, but now we know we should do that in our marketing. We should learn more about what contributes to a sense of belonging. We should find out what pockets of the organization are experiencing more belonging versus less, etc. But that would be an example of how AI can add value and not be dependent upon what HR already knows.
Well, there are two ways that you can strategically use AI. One is to reduce cost, and the other is to enhance the value of what you're providing your talent base, your people within your organization, and your customers.
Or to do things you haven't done before.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what I mean in terms of adding value.
Oh, yes. Right. It might be something that just wasn't even on your screen before.
On your radar screen before.
Yeah.
And from my point of view, one of the values you can add is that you can use these systems done the right way and with the right level of access to your organizational, email or whatever. You can find instances proactively of discriminatory behavior, of bigoted behavior, etc., and take proactive corrective measures. Now, every lawyer chills and thinks about the discoverability of that, but much rather have a discoverability problem than have a real bias and bigotry problem.
Yes.
And AI can really help with that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that this is an area of interest for you professionally and personally, because when I think of an organization like the Antidefamation League, the focus on bias and on unfair discrimination has been central to your core all along, and this is really just a more contemporary area where that can happen. So does your organization say this is really important for us to be?
Sure. So I'm here as a corporate lawyer who got interested in this, but our Center on Technology and Society spends a great deal of time thinking about these issues and thinking about how bigotry and anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of bigotry can be understood, identified, and exposed online in hateful environments. And we've been doing this for a very long time, back to our first report on bulletin boards of hate in their mid-'80s and forward, now to some very deep actually AI-based analysis of hate language and hate actions online.
Oh, that's really interesting. So one of the a study that I read that was really of great interest had to do with, actually it was a series of studies, but they looked at the ability of one kind of AI, which is facial recognition, to recognize the faces of human subjects. And the greatest success was identifying the faces of white men. And the very worst success, I mean, really dismal performance, was in recognizing the faces of women of color. And it was largely because of having fewer, we've talked about the fact that AI gets smarter the more data it learns from. So if you're learning from less data, you're going to be less smart as AI. And it had fewer examples of women of color, so therefore it was not performing as well. Well, the reason I'm telling you this story is these same authors then brought those findings to the makers of the three kinds of facial recognition software. And each of those companies took steps to improve its products. And each of those products performed better in subsequent tests. So it's a wonderful example of the power that HR people have to demand better AI, better products from vendors, and the impact you can have on the evolution of this. But I don't think those vendors they didn't know anything about those. I mean, this was complete. They also did not advise any of their customers before this research came out that there was actually this inconsistent reliability in the analysis. So I think there is an opportunity to advance the AI itself as consumers of it.
And these are companies that had great motivation to get it right.
Yes.
Right? They are security companies. They are, they're doing business with governments. They had great motivation to get it right, and they didn't. And we have to be asking the questions of the AI or the augmented technology that we bring into the human resources area. We have to interrogate it. We have to understand it to make sure, because this company could, doing with the video recognition, their issues are their issues, and hopefully they're solved. But your company's, reputation, your company's finances, your company's sense of doing right and wrong could be very well dependent on whether or not the sets that these AI systems were trained on, the machine learning systems were trained on, whether or not these sets were appropriate, accurate, sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't want to become the poster child.
And that's really one of the things that I think you should be asking of a provider of AI firms when you're thinking about actually,
Absolutely.
actually doing a purchasing and so forth. And one other implication I'll just throw off there, might be a little bit off topic, but I think people that are looking to move up in the HR field, one of the things you need to do is just have an understanding of how coding takes place. You aren't going to become an advanced technology person, but you need to understand how these coding systems take place, take a course or two, so that you can ask those questions and really be able to make that kind of assessment.
We've heard of companies that require that everybody in the company learn coding, just as a way to have the kind of general appreciation and awareness that you've talked about. Hey, we are just about out of time, so I want to thank you both very much for joining us for this conversation. We could have gone a lot longer, I know, and I've just whizzed past some of the really good questions that Steve has provided, and they'll be part of the deck. Very concrete suggestions for what you can do as a potential consumer of these sorts of solutions. So I recommend them to you, but I want to just tell you that this research will be published in mid-November, and on the screen you'll see the name of the report, which you'll be able to download from our website if you're members of the conference board. And beginning in December, we're also going to be doing a whole series on through 2020 on AI as it applies to specific areas of HR going into greater depth. So that may be of interest to you. I also want to tell you about next month's Human Capital Watch. My two colleagues, Marian Devine and Laura Sabatini, will be talking about our then new research, which is on taking D&I global, based on interviews with companies globally, and that is will be really interesting and I think quite new. And then finally, I want to, as a coupon shopper myself, I want to give you a couple of great discounts here. There's a discount code that you can use for reduced registration for AI in the workplace, which will be a great session here on December 5th. And so check that out. If you're interested in this topic, and you obviously are, then this might be of value to you. And maybe there are others on your team, either in HR or elsewhere, who would be also interested in this. And then finally, one more discount, but wait, there's more, is another code you can use for discount in the Learning and Development Summit, which is taking place in just about a month's time here in New York. So I want to encourage you, last thing, is to fill out the very brief evaluation that you'll be getting immediately after this webcast. We pour over these things and really pay attention. So please do that. And also you will receive a link to the slides themselves, and you'll be able to download those. And then finally, there will be a recording of this webcast that can be downloaded afterwards if you want to share this with any colleagues. So thank you very much for attending. Thanks to our guests, and we wish you a good day.